The two-nation theory. Jinnah was not the first to call the Muslims of India a nation. Before him, Sayyid Ahmad Khan had addressed them as a Qawm, an Urdu word which can be paraphrased as nation. The Aga Khan, Amir Ali, and others often referred to their community as a nation or a nationality. But it was Jinnah who, for the first time, proclaimed that India was inhabited by two distinct nations, Hindus and Muslims, which could not live in one state. He expounded this two-nation theory in such detail and with such effect that most Muslims and even some Hindus came to believe in its truth. The Muslim League demand for Pakistan was based on this theory, and though generally neither the Hindus nor the British accepted it, India was partitioned on the premise that Muslims constituted a separate nation and should therefore be given a separate state. The real problem of India was national. The Hindus claimed that India was one nation and a united country and wanted independence. The Muslims replied with the counterclaim that India was neither a unity nor a nation, that the Muslims formed a separate nation, and that Muslim freedom from Hindu domination was as essential as Indian liberation from British rule. The theory enunciated. The most clear and emphatic exposition of the theory is to be found in Jinnah's statements and speeches. The substance of his argument can be put as follows. Hinduism and Islam represented two distinct and separate civilizations and were in fact as distinct from one another in origin, tradition and manner of life as were the different European nations. In India, there was a major and a minor nation, and it followed that a parliamentary system based on the principle of majority rule must inevitably mean the rule of the major nation. Therefore, a constitution must be evolved that recognized the fact that there were in India two nations, both of whom must share the governance of their common motherland. One thing was now obvious, that we are by no means a minority but a solid and distinct nation by ourselves, with a destiny of our own. It was in his presidential address to the Muslim League session in Lahore, at which the partition resolution was passed, that he explained the theory in detail. Notwithstanding 1,000 years of close contact, nationalities which are as divergent today as ever cannot at any time be expected to transform themselves into one nation, merely by means of subjecting them to democratic constitution and holding them forcibly together by unnatural and artificial methods of British parliamentary statute. The problem in India was not of an intercommunal character, but manifestly of an international one, and it must be treated as such. If Britain was really in earnest and sincerely wanted to secure the peace and happiness of India, it should allow the major nations separate homelands by dividing India into autonomous national states. Hinduism and Islam are not religions in the strict sense of the word, but were in fact different and distinct social orders. And it is a dream that the Hindus and Muslims can ever evolve a common nationality. And this misconception of one Indian nation has gone far beyond the limits and is the cause of most of your troubles and will lead India to destruction if we fail to revise our notions in time. The Hindus and Muslims belong to two different religions, philosophies, social customs, literatures. They neither intermarry nor interdine together, and indeed they belong to two different civilizations which are based mainly on conflicting ideas and conceptions. Their aspects on life and of life are different. It is quite clear that Hindus and Muslims derive their inspiration from different sources of history. They have different epics, different heroes and different episodes. Very often the hero of one is a foe of the other, and likewise their victories and defeats overlap. To yoke together two such nations under a single state, one as a numerical minority and the other as a majority, must lead to growing discontent and final destruction of any fabric that may be so built up for the government of such a nation. Muslims are a nation according to any definition of a nation, and they must have their homelands, their territory, and their state. We wish to live in peace and harmony with our neighbors as a free and independent people. We wish our people to develop to the fullest of our spiritual, cultural, economic, social, and political life in any way that we think best and in consonance with our own ideals and according to the genius of our people. To the Hindu objection that Muslims were mere invaders and outsiders and had thus no territorial right to India, Jinnah's answer was rooted in the logic of Indian history. Surely, India is not the sole property of the Congress, and if the real mother was to be discovered, it would be the Dravidians and still further the Aborigines. It would neither be the Aryan nor the Mussalman. The Aryan claim to India is no better than that of Mussalmans, except that they were earlier arrivals in point of time. Even a nationalist Muslim who was opposed to the two nation theory admitted that Muslims felt that they cannot withstand humiliating conditions and they would much rather live in the hell of Pakistan than serve in the heaven of Hindustan and its degrading economic and social treatment. The fact was that Muslims had maintained their separate entity in India for several centuries, first as victorious invaders and imperial rulers, and later as fellow subjects of the British. When the Hindus awoke to their position of strength, vouchsafed by numerical majority, the Muslims realized their peril and reasserted their ancient superiority. Since it was no longer possible to rule over the whole of India as they had done in the past, they must consolidate what they had or could have and thus check the process which would certainly undermine the entire structure of their religion, culture and tradition. This was the central argument on which Muslim India reared the two-nation theory. Several Hindu and many British writers on India have admitted the deep rift between Hindus and Muslims in Indian society and politics. To take the Hindus first, in 1926 a Hindu emphasized the distinctiveness of the Muslim population and the fact that this distinctiveness had been maintained up to that time. The broadest division of Indian population was between Hindus and the Muslims. In 1939, another student of the Indian minority problem who wrote a doctoral thesis at Columbia to disprove the necessity and wisdom of communal representation began his treatment of the subject by the bland statement that India is a land of nations. In 1943, another Hindu declared that the demand for Pakistan was the result of an acute and genuine Muslim apprehension that in case of a united India, they would be submerged by the overwhelming majority of Hindus. His picture of a future India was that of a number of autonomous states with a central government of a confederal type. A most perceptive explanation of the Hindu-Muslim discord is given by Niraj Chaudhary. The Hindus, led by their scholarly elite, came to believe that there was a cultural heritage common to the Indian Muslims and Hindus. In reality, the so-called common heritage was hardly deeper than a veneer to begin with and found to be extremely fragile in the event. The relative quickness with which its hold weakened on the people of India leads one to conclude that it had some inherent weakness. So it had the common heritage was not a homogeneous product. As long as the Hindu masses of India remained the adherents of a primitive kind of Hinduism created by the breakup of the ancient Indian civilization, and the Muslim masses remained a horde of semi-Islamized converts, all was likely to go well with the common heritage. But were either of the two wings to rise to a higher plane, they were sure to move in opposite directions. In that event, the Hindus would become more Hinduized and the Muslims more Islamic. This was what actually happened. As a result of the resuscitation of the Hindu past, the 19th century witnessed a progressive de-Islamization of the non-Muslims of India and together with a tremendous revival of Hindu traditions. On the Muslim side, there was a continuous attempt to complete the Islamization of the Muslims of India, both qualitatively and quantitatively. The process inevitably tended towards a waning loyalty to the common heritage. The common heritage was a pleasant modus vivendi for the Hindus and Muslims in certain conditions. But it could do nothing, nor did it do anything, either to modify the group consciousness of the members of the two societies or to make them forget that they were antithetical in all matters except a few in essentials. The heart of the matter was that the Hindu, as a member of a closed society based on birth and blood, found it hard to understand the nature of an open society which can expand itself through proselytization and conversion. This long passage has been reproduced because it touches the pith of the argument and uncovers the roots of the Hindu-Muslim enmity. During the same period, several British observers with Indian experience had also underlined the essential disunity of India and her lack of national solidarity. Sir Sidney Low and Lord Meston enumerated the obstacles to the creation of a true national spirit, while E. A. Horne saw even when Hindu-Muslim enmity was at its peak, a fundamental antagonism of thought and feeling. In India, religions were a substitute for nationalities, and the Muslims in particular were to all intent a nation, and the government has to regard them as such. The pressure of British domination and the universal use of English as a language throughout the country were factors making for national unity. But these were artificial ingredients of nationalism and could not be expected to result in a group of solidarity in a country with such wide diversity and variety. The Muslims fear that in a united Indian democratic government they would be swamped and devoured by the Hindus in the last resort, and this was freely acknowledged by leading Indian statesmen in both camps. The Muslims would fight rather than submit. Indian unity was based on shallow and unhealthy foundations. After all, it is only the unifying bond of indifferent submission or hostility to alien rule that has held India together. As that bond was being removed, the essential discord was being demonstrated. The Muslims did not seek supremacy over all India. They wanted to be sure that if harmonious cooperation with Hinduism proves finally impossible, they will not be denied. On that account, the next best thing in constitutional advance, by the beginning of 1942, there was not a single Muslim in India who would not resent any form of constitution which put the Hindus into not only a permanent majority but a permanent position of power. A year before the creation of Pakistan, The Economist traced the origin of Muslim nationalism in an article which showed a deep understanding of the situation. There had never been such a state as Pakistan, but then neither was there a Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia before 1919. The reality is the Muslim population of India, some 1990 millions, with its own system of law and social organization, its own distinct variant of the Hindustani language, its historical traditions and its connections outside India. The Hindu-controlled Congress provincial governments of 1937 to 9 had behaved arrogantly, and this caused the phenomenal growth of Muslim nationalism. When the present tension in India is viewed in its historical setting, it cannot be denied that we are confronted by something more than a mere factional strife within a single nation. Internal evidence. The usual Congress Hindu answer to the danger of communalism was that with the development of economic ideas, all Hindu-Muslim trouble would by itself come to an end. This, however, was no more than wishful thinking or shutting the eyes to unpleasant realities. The fact was that even among the Indian labor, where according to the Congress theory there should have been complete solidarity, unity was missing. The Trade Union Congress and the Trade Union Federation were in the earlier stages purely labor organizations without communal bias, but as Muslim nationalism grew, the Muslim working classes began to realize the danger of Hindu domination in trade unions. Gradually, separate unions came to life, which made a point of Muslim rights as strongly as the Muslim League was doing in the political field. Just before partition, the All India Trade Union Congress was as much representative of Muslim labor as was the Indian National Congress of Muslim masses. The Hindus made no serious effort to reassure the Muslims or to allay their fear. On the other hand, several Hindu leaders and intellectuals of influence are on record as having glorified Hinduism and desired its supremacy over the entire subcontinent, even beyond her boundaries. According to Rabindranath Tagore, the Hindu poet and Nobel Prize winner, the term Hindu had an extended connotation. Islam denoted a particular religion, but the concept of a Hindu in the history of India was coeval with that of a nation in its social sense. One Hindu writer, in a book which purported to be an academic study of communal riots, seriously suggested the following cures for the removal of Hindu-Muslim rivalry. Islam should change its name to Nirakar Samaj. All Muslims should become Hindus. all communal educational institutions should be abolished, and all communal electorates should be immediately done away with. A Hindu professor claimed that Hindu was a territorial term rather than a badge of religion, and that therefore all Muslims were in fact Hindus. And therefore, by his logic, there was no communal problem, and the Congress resolution on self-determination was silly. Lala Hardayal, the legendary figure of Hindu Renaissance, was even more ambitious. He said that if Hindus wanted to protect themselves, they must conquer Afghanistan and the frontiers and convert them to Hinduism. Another Hindu leader contented himself by saying that to force Muslims into an Indian national state would not be compulsion. Such expressions of Hindu imperialism did not add to the Muslim feeling of security. Even Lord Mountbatten, no friend of the Muslims, had told Gandhi that if the partition had not been made during British occupation, the Hindus, being the major party, would have never allowed partition and held the Muslims by force under subjection. There can hardly be more impartial evidence to dispose of the Congress thesis that the moment the British withdrew, communal peace would return to India and all Hindu-Muslim trouble would be forgotten in the glow of freedom. Separate electorates. Whether the Muslims demanded separate representation in legislatures because they considered themselves a separate nation, or the two-nation theory was advanced because the working of separate electorates for many years had made the Muslims conscious of their distinctiveness, is a pointless controversy. What is more important is to find out the connection between the two and to assess the influence of the electorate on the working out of the theory. We may say that the demand for separate electorates was a manifestation of Muslim feeling of separateness. Whether this feeling had by then matured into a full-fledged theory or not is difficult to see. In the elections of 1892, out of the candidates recommended by the various electoral bodies for the Central Council, the Muslims obtained only about half the number to which their numerical strength entitled them. For the Council of the United Provinces, not a single Muslim had been recommended. When therefore it was known that the British government was contemplating reforms for India which would introduce a larger element of representation, the Muslims in 1906 took a deputation to the Viceroy to argue their case for separate representation in all local and provincial elected bodies. This claim was based on three grounds. A. In the existing state of tension between Hindus and Muslims, no Muslim who sincerely represented the opinions of his community could secure election in a general electorate, since in all but two provinces Muslims were a minority of the population. B. If the two communities were not kept apart at the polls, every contested election would result in communal riots, accompanied by bloodshed, and would leave bitter memories which would retard the political integration of the country. C. Where the system of separate electorates had been established, as in municipalities and district boards, it had worked well and secured peace. Simultaneously, the deputation also made a plea for weightage, i.e. the concession of more seats to the Muslims than their population figure warranted. This demand was supported by another set of three arguments. A. Muslims still owned much of the landed property in India. B. They constituted a very large proportion of the Indian army. C. They were geographically speaking the gatekeepers of India. The political principle behind this demand was underlined in an eloquent sentence by the Economist. Whatever may be the political atom in India, it is certainly not the individual of Western democratic theory, but the community of some sort. The significance of the Muslim demand was fully brought out in the debate which accompanied the making of the moral and mental reforms. The main point made by the Muslims was that the type of Muslim who secured Hindu support did so by virtue of his utility to Hindu rather than Muslim interests. Yet this was the type most likely to be elected of if separate electorates were not created. The experiment of a double register had proved very successful in the Austrian Empire as a means of preventing national conflicts. Where conflicting nationalities occupied the same territory, experience proved that the most effective way of setting them by the ears was to let them fight out a contested election. To preserve harmony, it was necessary to take away from them any such occasion for strife. This could only be done by separate representation. One major argument against the system was that such admission of divided allegiance by the state was against the history of self-government. Another was that division by creeds and classes taught men to think as partisans, that the give and take which was the essence of political life was lacking, and that it stereotyped existing relations and perpetuated current splits. To the objection that communal representation was opposed to the teaching of history, it could be answered that it was only the history of Western democracy that was being considered, and that the teaching of Indian history exhibited an entirely different picture. Similarly, the apprehension that it would stereotype existing relations presupposed that the Western pattern of popular government was suited to India, a presumption of doubtful validity. There was another answer to this argument too. The Muslims hoped that a time would come when the growth of full unity of sentiment and a complete consciousness of identity of interest would remove the necessity for special representation. Until then, Muslim representation must continue. The Aga Khan gave still another reason for the extension of the principle of separate representation to other minorities. It would stimulate an interest in public affairs on the part of the backward classes, and this he received firm support from Sir Valentine Cairo, who took exception to the inadequate allowance the Montagu Council report made for the deep lines of cleavage in Indian society. Theoretical objections to separate electorates had led the writers of the report to restrict it within narrower limits than the actual circumstances showed. The report professed to be afraid of accepting existing divisions, but was there not a greater danger still in seeking to ignore their existence? Was the danger of doing a grave injustice to those who were most liable to suffer from their existence? The Simon report shared all the objections raised by its predecessor, the Montagu Council report, against a separate Muslim electorate, but found it unavoidable in view of the general Muslim feeling of alarm if it were not conceded. The absence of a Hindu-Muslim settlement and the unanimity and firmness with which all Muslims demanded. The issue of a Muslim electorate was thoroughly debated in British and Indian political circles on three major occasions, viz. The making of the 1909 reforms, the framing of the 1919 reforms, and the Round Table Conference. On all of them, the Hindus expressed their resentment against this concession to Muslims, though on one occasion they had previously committed themselves to the principle of the Lucknow Pact of 1916. The Hindu argument that they were opposed to the system on purely national grounds is believed by the inconsistency they showed in applying this standard to India and to Ceylon. Whereas in India they objected to communal representation. In Ceylon they themselves asked for it. The natural explanation is that in India they were a majority and did not approve of any diminution of their right to rule the country. In Ceylon they were in a minority and felt to be in need of safeguards. But what was politically practicable and wise in Ceylon was disruption and divide and rule in India. It was such show of blatant opportunism that alienated the Muslims and gradually led them to the conclusion that they could not live together with the Hindus under one political roof. Nationalists, Muslims, and Muslim nationalism. This alienation, however, was not total. There was throughout the course of modern Indian politics a section of Muslims which did not share the general Muslim view that a Hindu-Muslim entente was impossible or that separation was the only solution. This group may be called the Congress school of Muslims, as politically it always identified itself with the Congress. It may also be called the Nationalist Muslim group, for that was the label given to it by the Congress and accepted by it. Nationalist Muslims were Muslims who were opposed to Muslim separatism, to the new two-nation theory, and later to the Pakistan demand, and who subscribed to the Congress view of the communal problem. They believed in one united Indian nationalism in which religious affiliations were both irrelevant and undesirable. Some features of this group are noticeable. First, it was led by some men of exceptional ability and transparent sincerity. Their worst enemies cannot prove that they were men without deep convictions or without the courage to espouse an unpopular cause. Man of the stamp of Ansari and Ajmal Khan, Hussain Ahmad Madani and Abdul Kalam Azad, Mahmud Hassan and Mahmud Ali could not be bought. Secondly, it was an elite of intellect rather than a band of mass leaders. It is true that Muhammad Ali was an idol of the people, that Ansari was respected by the whole country, and that Ajmal Khan enjoyed great popularity among the masses, but this was only true of the hectic Khilafat days when emotions ran high and anyone with Islam on his lips was treated as a celebrity. Once the sweep of the movement had weakened, their audience shrank and their following melted away. Others among them, like the Deoband ulama, who never the man of the public, on the whole, the group provided intellectual leadership to the non-Muslim League Muslims, thought out a philosophy to give backbone to their political activity and quite unwittingly emphasized the Muslim or Islamic strand of Indian nationalism. A third characteristic of this group was the diverse backgrounds of its members. Their routes of entry into politics and their later careers and opinions were not the same. Azad started as a zealous Muslim, as an uncompromising upholder of pure Islam, as a man who, between 1912 and 1920, deepened and strengthened the foundations of Muslim nationalism, but after the demise of the Khilafat movement, he shed his earlier ideas and almost overnight became an ardent supporter of a united Indian nationalism of the Congress variety and remained steadfast to it till the end. Muhammad Ali was by turns a Muslim leaguer, a Khilafatist, a congressman, and towards the end a viral critic of the Congress. Both Ajmal Khan and Ansari were former presidents of the Muslim League who later turned to the Congress and never looked back. The nationalist Muslims were a small company and outside the Khilafat period. Their following among Muslims was insignificant. The record in election to Legislative Assembly was inglorious. Their organization was weak, loose and sporadic. Their following was a motley crowd of disgruntled Muslim leaguers, anti-British divines, Muslim congressmen and personal friends of Hindu leaders. Before examining the role of this group in Indian politics, let us briefly look at their opinions and beliefs. Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad is by common consent the outstanding spokesman of this school. He is also an interesting study because of the sudden and sweeping change in his outlook which occurred in 1920 or immediately afterwards. He began his career under the inspiration of Sayyid Ahmad Khan's writings which greatly impressed him. For him, religion and politics were inseparable. When launching his weekly paper Al-Hilal in June 1912, he declared that its aim was to invite Muslims to follow the Book of Allah and the Sharia of His Prophet. In cultural, political or other matters, Muslims ought to be Muslims. Asked if Muslims should join the Hindus in political matters, he answered, Islam is so exalted a religion that its followers are not constricted to aid the Hindus for the formulation of their political policy. Distinguishing this theory of nationalism from the Hindus, he wrote, Hindus can, like other nations, revive their self-awareness on the basis of secular nationalism. But it is indeed not possible for Muslims. He continued to profess and preach this brand of Muslim nationalism from 1912 to about 1920. After the failure of the Khilafat movement, he took his followers by surprise by shifting his ground suddenly and unexpectedly. He renounced his Islamic nationalism and embraced Indian nationalism. The votary of Muslim nationalism had come under the spell of the new Turkish nationalism and the nascent Arab nationalism and forsaken all earlier beliefs and pronounced his faith in a joint nationalism in India which he said was a prerequisite of winning independence from the British. From this time onwards, he became a loyal and trusted member of the Congress and never deviated from its policies. He was first elected as president in 1923, then every year from 1940 to 1946. His presidential address at Ramgarh, delivered in March 1940, is worth a passing mention. When he spoke, Muslim plans for separation had matured and the Lahore resolution was adopted in the same month. But oblivious of Muslim feelings and fears, he repeated the usual Hindu arguments and assured the Muslims that all would be well after the British had gone and freedom had come. There was no effort to understand the problem, to examine the foundations of Muslim apprehensions, to offer any alternatives to a united India or to Pakistan, to give any definite assurances to Muslims, or even to argue his own case with conviction. It was this blind identification with whatever the Congress laid down which was Azad's undoing. The more he merged himself with the Congress, the more he estranged even his own following. Until by about 1941 or 1942, it is doubtful if he represented anyone except the Hindus. The Muslims believed that he was being exploited by the Congress with a view to wearing the look of a national party. How could the Congress be a Hindu party if its president was a Muslim divine and a theologian? This was a clever idea but failed to work. No one was taken in except a handful of British leftists who anyway were too partial to the Congress to be open to conviction. The Congress leaders themselves were well aware of Maulana's unpopularity among his own co-religionists. In a book planned and edited by one of his staunch admirers, a well-known Congress leader, while paying his tribute to Azad, wrote, "Even if Akbar was disappointed by his fellow Muslims, why should we be surprised if Maulana Abdul Kalam received no response from the organized Muslims of India today?" Inconsistency of opinion and originality of thinking, the Deoband school and its political manifestation, the Jam- Jamiat-e-Ulama-e-Hind, were more representative of the nationalist Muslims than Azad. In 1867, a Darul Uloom was established in Deoband under the guidance of Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanavtawi as a counterpoise to Sayyid Ahmad Khan's West Oriented movement. In religion, it was sectarian, propounding the teachings of the Hanafi school of the theology. In sphere of influence, it was parochial, its reach confined to the United Provinces and Delhi. In politics, it was rabidly anti-British, preaching disloyalty to the government. In 1880, Nana Tavi died and was succeeded by Rashid Ahmad Gangoe, who gave a fatwa that in worldly matters cooperation with the Hindus was permissible, provided that it did not violence to any basic principles of Islam. This was done to allow the followers of Deoband to join the Indian National Congress. Gangoe was succeeded by Maulana Muhammad Mahmud Hassan in 1905 and in 1920. The headship of the school devolved upon Hussain Ahmad Madani. Deoband was the center of conservative Islam where young men of religious turn of mind were trained in theology, Islamic history and other old-fashioned disciplines. Western learning was taboo, for it was one of the fundamental beliefs of the school that any truck with the infidel West was tantamount to a compromise with heresy. Inevitably, therefore, the Darul Uloom produced mullahs who were skillful in theological hair-splitting, competent in expounding the orthodoxies of their particular sect, but completely ignorant of modern movements and developments even in Islam. When these graduates left the school and began the rounds of the countryside as peripatetic religious teachers, a great many of them, in the name of the spiritual guidance of the common man, have lived on his blood and sweat. There they have also fought religious wars against their counterparts of other schools like Barelvis and Ahle Hadith. Moreover, their purely religious training had kept them aloof and isolated, intellectually estranged from the people, educated in secular schools and colleges. The men of Deoband struck out a path of themselves which was different from Azad's, who was in the beginning an ardent Islamic nationalist, and from Madudi's, who was anti-Muslim League but even more anti-Congress, partly to play a more important role in the Khilafat movement and partly to enter the political field in their own right. In 1919, the Deoband Divines founded the Jamiat-e-Ulama-e-Hind. For the first few years, when party politics within Muslims as well as between them and the Hindus was silenced by the exigence of the Khilafat campaign, the Jamiat contained all varieties of divines. But once the Khilafat issue was dead, the Deobandis took it over and became the political arm of the Deoband school. Among its aims and objects were to defend Islam, Islamic rituals and customs, and Islamic nationalism against all odds and injuries to them, to achieve and protect the general religious and national rights of the Muslims, to establish good and friendly relations with the non-Muslims of the country to the extent permitted by the Shariat Islamiyah, and to fight for the freedom of the country and religion according to the Shari objectives. The Jamiat favored unconditional cooperation with the Congress so far as the cause of freedom was concerned. It believed that the Muslim minority in India need have no fear, as once the British were gone, the Hindus would come to terms with it. It was chiefly the British government which was responsible for the Hindu-Muslim conflict. In 1928, however, the Jamiat surprised the Congress by rejecting the Nehru report. Its criticism was based on 2 points. The safeguards provided for the Muslims was inadequate, and the plan for dominion status for India was inconsistent with the Jamiat's commitment to complete independence. But this estrangement was temporary, and peace was made in the following year when the Congress repudiated the Nehru report. In the 1937 Muslim mass contact campaign organized by the Congress, the Jamiat gave full support to the Congress. The Jamiat stood for a united nationalism. For India did not adhere to the two-nation theory, opposed the Pakistan plan, and argued for a territorial as opposed to religious nationalism. Its arguments against Muslim separation were the Pakistan demand has British support and is nothing but an instrument forged by them to further their policy of divide and rule. Pakistan will split and therefore weaken the Muslims of India. Our real enemy is British imperialism and our only duty to defeat it. Only united action can achieve this. Muslims left behind in India after separation will be at the mercy of the Hindus. Partition will hinder the missionary activities of the ulama. Muslim League leaders are ignorant of Islam, have no ideology, and are only exploiting the name of Islam for the worldly gain of its Muslim vested interests, and Muslim League leaders are incapable of building up an Islamic state, and their Pakistan will be no better than the Turkey of Mustafa Kemal. Towards the end, there was a split in the Jamaat on the issue of its attitude to the Pakistan plan. In 1946, a section defected and formed the Jamaat Ulama Islam, which worked in support of the Muslim League. Among the leaders of the breakaway group, there were two divines of admitted excellence and considerable influence, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi and Shabir Ahmad Usmani. Let the final word on the Jamaat be said by one of them. The ulama were not prepared to follow the Western-oriented Muslim intelligentsia whom they suspected to be the representatives of a different culture. They were still medieval in their outlook. They failed to understand the genesis of the Hindu Renaissance and never tried to comprehend the modern Islam, which in the 1930s under the poetic inspiration of Iqbal became an ideological force. The crux of its opposition lay in its traditional conception of Islam and the future fate of its Islam in Pakistan. The ulama thought that it was only they who could give the right lead to the Muslims. The Muslim League leaders were thus caught between two fires of exclusiveness, the Congress exclusiveness of nationalism and the Deoband exclusiveness of religion. For the Congress, they were too reactionary to enter the mainstream of Indian nationalism. For the Divines, they were too secular to lead the Muslims aright. To escape from this crossfire, they created a different conception of nationalism, which was partly religious, partly territorial. Muslim majority areas, all Muslim majority areas should form Pakistan, and wholly psychological. We feel that we are a nation. In spite of their small size, their muddled thinking and other weakness, the part played by the nationalist Muslims in Indian politics was far from unimportant. How can this be explained? Several factors helped them to occupy an exaggerated place in the political field. Their most effective weapon was their alliance with the Congress. They were, so to say, adopted by the Congress and offered to the public as the only nationalists among Muslims. They were happy to live in this borrowed glory, for it brought them status, stability, and immense monetary resources. This identification with a large Hindu organization had two other results. First, it made them indolent and intellectually sterile. If their political duty did not lie beyond endorsing the Congress policy, any further exertion was unnecessary. By becoming uncritical supporters of one party, they lost their power of thinking, their independence of outlook, and their former flexibility of maneuver, and even their former penchant for lively debate. Secondly, it made them even less agreeable to the Muslim masses. As the opponents of Muslim nationalism, it was incumbent upon them to meet it with equal argument, to try to provide a platform for non-Muslim League politics, to evolve a creed which could at least compete with other ideas and offer an alternative to separation. By repeating the Congress dogma ad infinitum, they confirmed that they had no wares of their own to put on the market. For this, they paid the price of unpopularity and near political extinction. This unwillingness to strike out a new path for themselves is astonishing, because the nationalist Muslims were men of wit and ability. Their learning was substantial, their scholarship exact, their intellectual achievements well known. When they spoke or wrote in defense of the Khilafat or in support of the Ottoman Empire, the arguments were sharp and their knowledge deep. When Azad commented on the Quran, his erudition was unrivaled and his understanding of Islam unerring. When the divines of Deoband expounded the orthodox Islam of which they were the modern touch bearers, their vision was unclouded and their logic straight. Ajmal Khan was a poet of distinction in two languages and commanded a lively imagination. Ansari, though a surgeon by profession, was a very learned man. But in Indian, apart from Islamic politics, their contribution was slight and shallow. Habitual dependence on the Congress had dried up their fountainhead of thinking. And yet there were thousands of Muslims who, in spite of their politics, admired them for their writings. their achievements in the realm of mind, and their reputation as savants. The nationalist Muslims were very vocal, and their voice was amplified by the Congress press. In the absence of a Muslim press, political propaganda in India was a Congress monopoly. This magnified the role and gave them publicity which was out of all proportion to their importance. Alliance with the Congress brought them another advantage. They were, or at least claimed to be, anti-imperialist, and this made for popular appeal. Their public image was improved by their anti-British propaganda, by their participation in non-cooperation campaigns, and by consequent imprisonment. For a great mass of people in India, politics meant opposition to the British and the martyrdom of imprisonment. The nationalist Muslims fulfilled these qualifications and so rose in public estimation. The Congress Muslim rank and file used to taunt the Muslim leaders by saying, "What sort of leader is your Jinnah who has never been to prison?" Another factor working to their advantage was their religious appeal to the masses. It is an irony of history that while the Congress always charged the Muslim League with bringing religion into politics and thus encouraging reaction, it was in fact the Congress Muslims whose entire popular support among the Muslim masses was rooted in religion. Azaz's politics was not acceptable even to a small section of Muslims, but he was esteemed and admired for his religious works. Hussain Ahmad Madani and his Deobandi colleagues had no opposition in politics, but in some areas they commanded obedience as religious leaders of a certain school of thought. Ansari and Ajmal Khan had no political following among Muslims, but in the Khilafat days their star was in the ascendant. In Muslim societies, it has always been easy to win popular acclaim by making religion an issue. This explains the hold of the nationalist Muslims on certain Muslim circles. On the other hand, the fact that even this religious appeal failed to win them popular support explains the unshakable distrust of the great majority of Muslims in all those who allied themselves with the Congress. In the preceding chapters, we have tried to set Muslim nationalism against the background of Muslim thought and politics. But how far was the Congress responsible for the emergence of national consciousness among the Muslims? This is an important question because Muslim nationalism did not grow in a vacuum. Two forces intermingled to give birth to it. One was the Muslim feeling of separatism, the other was the Hindu attitude to the Muslim problem as a whole. It is impossible to study the development of Muslim nationalism without closely examining the impact of both the factors. So far, we have dealt only with the Muslim aspect of the question, how Muslim thinking and experience shaped their national growth. The rest of this chapter is intended to appraise the role of the Congress or the Hindus in its growth. The question is complicated and therefore the temptation to oversimplify is great. It is commonly remarked that the Muslims owed the creation of Pakistan to the Congress in the sense that had the Congress treated the Muslims indifferently, there would have been no Muslim separatism and therefore no Pakistan. There is more than a modicum of truth in this popular generalization. But Congress thinking on the Muslim problem was so confusing that it is difficult for an historian to portray the situation in straight, clean lines. There are too many curves and contours in the picture to lend themselves to a simple description or to an analysis in black and white. The only stark fact is that the Congress never made a serious effort to understand the Muslim problem. It had no definite policy on the matter and tried to meet each crisis as it arose. But it is difficult to practice this typically. British empiricalism in politics without the British genius for compromise which goes with it. When the Congress was founded in 1885, an attempt was made to woo the intelligentsia into joining it. But Syed Ahmad Khan in northern India and Amir Ali in Bengal rejected these overtures, partly under the influence of the traditional post-mutiny thinking, partly because of the Muslim policy of loyalty, which was then becoming fashionable among Muslim leaders, and partly because of the predominantly Hindu composition and tone of the Congress itself. This initial repudiation of the Congress was big with consequences, and visibly reproduced itself on all important occasions during the following 60 years. And this rejection was not, as most congressmen suggested, a mere figment of the Muslim and British political imagination. The Congress would not have chosen to castigate the Muslim demand for separate representation. Had it really had a Muslim following, Pandit Madan Mohan Malaviya, a great congressman, Mahasahibte confessed that Muslims had kept aloof from the Congress. By signing the Lucknow Pact, the Congress supplied a statutory confirmation of its failure to speak for Muslim India. For a party does not enter into a pact of this nature with its own followers, but only with a rival or enemy. Organization speaking as the president of the Special Congress Conference held at Lucknow on 10 August 1917. Pandit Motilal Nehru referred to the Congress and the Muslim League as those national bodies which represent the best intellect and culture of the country. Unfortunately, this was the last occasion on which the Muslim League was acknowledged to be a national body by a Congress leader. After the failure of the Khilafat movement, the tide of events moved fast towards an irretrievable split between the two national bodies. The Nehru Report, prepared under the chairmanship of Motilal Nehru, repudiated the status of the Muslim League as a representative body and challenged it to a showdown by recommending the immediate abolition of separate electorates without compensation. The flood of unrestrained democracy against which Syed Ahmad Khan had warned his people had overtaken the spirit of accommodation which the Congress had shown at Lucknow and had in the process inundated all Muslim expectations of an honorable alliance with the Congress. The Round Table Conference and the making of the 1935 Constitution did not mend matters. The divorce was signed, ratified and confirmed by the communal award and the Congress attitude towards it. The elections of 1937 registered this separation, and in 1938 two staunch congressmen writing a semi-official history of the organization had to confess that the Muslims had generally kept away from it. The part which the Congress provincial governments of 1937 to 1939 played in alienating the Muslims, strengthening the roots of their separatism and laying the foundation of Pakistan is too well known to bear repetition. Of all the Congress leaders, Gandhi was the most vocal on the necessity of achieving Hindu-Muslim unity. He claimed that he had made it a part of the Congress program and declared again and again that independence would not come till the demon of communalism was exercised. But even he always spoke of Hindus as we and of Muslims as they. He refused to distinguish between a Hindu Indian and a Muslim Indian, but said in November 1946, when Muslim fears were at the highest pitch, that when British troops were gone, the majority would know how to behave towards the minority. He repeatedly said that he had no objection of if the central government was given into the control of the Muslim League and Jinnah was made the Prime Minister of the country. But when in November 1946, the Viceroy requested him to sign along with Jinnah a statement condemning violence and asking Indians to stop fighting among themselves, he refused with the remark that this was parity with a vengeance. A man who was ready to lay down his life for communal peace could not bear to see his name coupled with Jinnah's, with whom in 1944 he had carried on negotiations on an equal footing. It was Gandhi who in 1945 overruled Desai and ordered that the Congress should proceed to form a government in the frontier province. Although the Congress was not allowed to take up power in any province under instructions from the High Command issued in November 1939. Muslims were quick to see in this the Hindu determination to keep Muslim League out of power in a Muslim province. In view of all this, there was some justification for the Muslim inability to take Gandhi's protestations of his love for the Muslims as seriously as he himself took them. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, after Gandhi, the most important Hindu leader, adopted a different attitude towards the Muslim problem. He denied its very existence. There was no such problem as a Muslim problem in India. Communalism was mere propaganda and would not present the slightest difficulty. It was overrated and overemphasized. It did not fundamentally affect the masses. As social issues would come to the forefront, it is bound to recede into the background. Yet it was Nehru who started the ill-fated campaign of Muslim mass contact, thus not only admitting the existence of a Hindu-Muslim problem, but also showing his true feelings in relation to the Muslim League. Subsequent events convinced Nehru that the communal problem could not be wished away by denying its existence. In early 1947, when the Hindus of the Punjab and Bengal urged him to demand a partition of their provinces in order to safeguard them against the rule of the majority, he immediately accepted the logic and the justice of their suggestion. This acceptance was a proof of the fact that, in contrast to his earlier view of communalism, he recognized it to be an abiding and centrifugal force in Indian politics. If he did not really believe in the two-nation theory, he should have opposed the Bengali Hindus, desired to cut loose on the Muslim majority, and instead should have supported the conception of a united Bengal, which was then being propagated in earnest by some Hindu and Muslim Bengali leaders. Again, in his statement on 15 August 1947, he voiced the sadness of many Indians for our brothers and sisters who have been cut off from us by political boundaries and who unhappily cannot share at present in the freedom that had come. Obviously, he was referring to the Hindus left in Pakistan, who, in his opinion, were not free. The implication is apparent that the Hindus of India were one nation, that a part of this nation had been left in Pakistan, and that this part was yet not free because it was under the rule of another nation. The Muslims, it is difficult to put a different construction on his words. The Congress' responsibility for the creation and encouragement of Muslim separation lies in the fact that it did not evolve a policy to handle the Muslims. It made no effort to convince the Muslim masses of the goodness of its own brand of nationalism. It did not attempt to persuade the Muslim citizenry of the benefits of a non-communal democracy. It took a half-hearted stand on the communal reward and did not counter the separatist tendencies of the Muslim voters, which had unmistakably shown themselves in the election of 1937. By refusing to contest Muslim seats in these elections, it admitted its non-Muslim character. Or out of a total of 482 Muslim seats in the provinces, it had the courage or the wisdom of contesting only 58 and the ignominy of winning only 26. By this performance or the failure of it, it forfeited all title to speak for India. Yet it persisted in ignoring other parties and claiming for itself an all-inclusive status. The electoral verdict had gone against it and proved to all that it had no hold over the Muslim community. But that did not discourage it from accusing other parties of being unrepresentative of the people. It refused to acknowledge the credentials of any Muslim politicians other than its own nationalist Muslim, who it duly paraded on all ceremonial occasions. This was a short-sighted policy and did great harm to its prospects as a nationalist party seeking independence for the whole of India. On the other hand, it incensed an overwhelming majority of the Muslims who looked at the handful of Congress Muslims as nothing less than renegades who had surrendered their self-respect for a ribbon to stick in their coat. This redoubled their resolve to consolidate their strength and to repost the Congress nationalism with an equally resolute Muslim nationalism, the Congress policy of divide and rule. The Congress approach to the Muslim problem was complicated by yet another factor. Throughout its history, there was an element of divide and rule in its policy vis-a-vis the Muslims. After its initial lack of success in recruiting Muslims to its fold, it practiced in relation to Muslim India exactly what it accused the British of practicing in relation to India as a whole. A deliberate effort was made to break the political unity of the Muslims and to cajole, persuade and humor some of them into joining the Congress ranks. Its infancy, it captured a few Muslim public figures like Badruddin Tayyibji and Rahmatullah Siani. During the debate on the moral and mental reforms, it was able to enlist Sir Imam, who was vocal in his opposition to the Muslim demand for separate representation. During the Khilafat period, of course, there was a sizable group of Muslims who did not distinguish between the Congress and the Muslim League, insofar as both were considering on the Turkish question. But after the disintegration of this unity, a few Muslims still lingered on in the Congress, some out of the genuine conviction that it represented a sense of nationalism, some out of blinding frustration which accompanied the fiasco of the Khilafat movement, and some because of the absence of the strong Muslim reorganization to which they could attach themselves. There has been a long and at times distinguished line of Muslim leaders who had at one time or another allied themselves with the Congress: Tayyib Ji, Muhammad Ali, Shaukat Ali, M.A. Ansari, Ajmal Khan, Abdul Kalam Azad, Zakir Hussain, and above all, Jinnah. To recall their loyalty to the Congress is not to accuse them of insincerity in conviction or of trickery in politics. They were all men of intelligence and considerable political acumen, and their conversion cannot be explained away by Congress trickery. They were not bribed, though the Congress was not above dangling ministerial prizes before the lesser breed of nationalist Muslims, particularly during its supremacy in the provincial field. The point is that the Congress made a consistent effort to breach the Muslim front and to take away from the Muslim League as many leaders as it could. One important weapon in this one-sided war of nerves was the enthusiasm with which the Congress sought and forged alliances with some Muslim organizations which did not share the ideals of Muslim League. It allied itself with such miscellaneous bodies as the Red Shirts, the Eras, the Moments, the Shia Conference, and the Jamaat Ulama. Sometimes it created an anti-Muslim League front. Example, Croatia in 1940, it put up an Azad Muslim Conference to counteract the Muslim League and to oppose the Pakistan resolution. Sometimes this anxiety to keep the Muslim League isolated from other Muslim groups led it to the acts of blatant opportunism and politically folly. The best example of this was the Congress alliance with the Punjab Unionist Party in 1946 to form the Punjab Provincial Ministry. It must be recalled that in 1937 the Congress had flatly refused to share power with the Muslim League on the ground that it could not compromise its economic and social program by forming a coalition with a conservative body like League. But in 1946, the same Congress party cheerfully agreed to form a coalition in the Punjab with the Unionist Party, which was notoriously reactionary in policy and feudal in composition, and which had won only a handful of seats in the legislature. It was even worse than a coalition because the leader of the tiny Unionist Party was accepted as chief minister. This unnatural alliance can be explained in political terms. It was a tactical move to keep the Muslim League out of office in a province where it had won an overwhelming majority of Muslim seats. This telling contrast between its proclaimed principles and its political action convinced the Muslims that the Congress had no policy or principle except to divide the Muslims with a view to maintaining its own hegemony. Even the language used by the Congress to describe the Muslim League and its friends on the one hand and the Congress Muslims on the other was meant to divide the Muslims and to mislead the outside observers. Muslim politics was always referred to as communalism, a dirty word in Indian politics. In all political debate, the Muslim point of view was either an airily dismissed or contemptuously sneered at as charlatanism. So persistent was this propaganda and so effectively done that all foreign writers on India adopted this phraseology without criticism. When the Congress made a demand, it was the voice of Indian nationalism. When the Muslims asked for something that was communalism, even Pakistan was painted as a child of communal politics rather than of nationalist urge. In contrast to this, all Muslims who joined the Congress were given the honorable designation of nationalist Muslims. A Muslim was a communalist and ipso facto an enemy of Indian freedom. If he was a Muslim leaguer, but the same Muslim became a nationalist and therefore a valiant soldier in the cause of independence, as soon as he had filled in the Congress membership form. Here again Congress propaganda was so well done that to this day the phrase nationalist Muslims is referred for one who sided with the Congress. Even the British rulers, who were alleged to be the perfect practitioners of the policy of divide and rule, did not create such phraseology or use it to such lethal effect. Two interesting aspects of Congress policy must be noticed. The Congress encouraged and allied itself with only the weak and backward Muslim groups. The Jamaat Ulama, a reactionary semi-theological body which looked askance at all efforts to liberalize Islam. The Eras, a Punjabi organization of middle-class Muslims whose militarism outran their intelligence. The Moments, a class of poor and illiterate weavers. The Shia Conference, a splinter group which wanted to fight the Sunnis with Congress help. It is important to remember that none of these organizations contributed to the leadership of the Congress. The important nationalist Muslims were individuals who came to the Congress from other sources and not as leaders of these minor groups. On the whole, the so-called Muslim Nationalist Party was of no practical use to the Congress. On the testimony of a Hindu historian, it was so poor in numbers and so weak in influence that its voice remained almost unheard. Even in the frontier province, which the Congress always proffered, was the most striking refutation of the League claim to speak for Muslim India. The nationalist Muslim leaders did not have the courage to participate in the 1947 referendum, which was held to ascertain whether the province wanted to join Pakistan or India. This alliance with nationalist Muslim individuals and groups did not in the end pay the Congress. In practical politics, they remained a drag on the Congress for two reasons. They failed to convert any appreciable section of the Muslim community to Congress secularism, and they vitally influenced the Congress decisions relating to communal settlement. Not only that, but VP Menon, who had access to inside information, thinks that even the safeguard and protection demanded for their community by the nationalist Muslims went so far that if acceded to, they would have prevented for all time the growth of a united nation. It is not insignificant that in 1942, when C. Rajgopalachari resolution on recognizing the Pakistan scheme was voted upon in the All India Congress Committee, five prominent Muslim members of the committee, Ghaffar Khan, Khan Sahib, Mia Iftikharuddin, Dr. Ansari, Secretary of the Azad Muslim Board, and the Muslim Minister of Education in Sindh, supported the resolution. In addition, all the members from the frontier provinces remained neutral. In Bombay, the Congress made a Muslim member of the Assembly sign the Congress pledge on one day and made him minister the next day. This was indeed a travesty of Muslim representation, when the Muslim minister had not the confidence of the 22 Muslim League members of the Bombay Legislative Assembly. The fact of the matter is that the Congress leaders were so obsessed with the Western principle, majority rule, that they shut their eyes to the magnitude of the Muslim problem and thought that they would be able to deal with it effectively either by completely ignoring it or by weaning away Muslims from the Muslim League. They, and especially Gandhi, were anti-imperialist vis-a-vis Britain, but imperialist vis-a-vis Pakistan. The paradox of the Congress approach. The paradox of the situation lies in the fact that in spite of this approach to Muslim nationalism, the Congress was at the same time conscious of the existence of Indian disunity, and in the later stages it in effect acknowledged the two-nation theory. That it did so reluctantly and under acute pressure of events does not affect the argument. It is said that during the First World War, the Hindus, particularly the Jats, showed great eagerness to join the Indian army because they wanted to fight the Turks. The Muslims came forward to enlist in a spirit of loyal duty, the Sikhs for sheer love of fighting, but the Hindus rallied against their hereditary enemy as if it to a crusade. The Hindu masses looked upon Muslims as one big caste and as trespassers in India, and this underlying tension was noticed by many Congress leaders. Motilal Nehru, as President of the Congress, did not wish to make of India a cheap and slavish imitation of the West, for Western democracy had not proved a panacea for all ills and had not solved the problems facing India. In 1928, again as the Congress President, he confessed that there is no overlooking the fact that we are divided into a number of large and small communities, more or less disorganized and demoralized. This shows that in spite of the Congress' insistence on the rule of the majority and on the supposed unity of India, it acknowledged the difficulties involved in erecting a political system which did not take notice of Indian divergences. In 1947, soon after the All India Congress Committee had ratified acceptance on the 3 June plan, the chief minister of one of the Hindu provinces declared in a public meeting that Muslims left in India could not expect to be treated otherwise than as aliens. They would have no citizenship rights. The Moments, who had always supported the Congress and were counted among the most ardent nationalist Muslims, were not spared the horrors of killing during the Bihar riots of 1946. In fact, they alleged that many leaders high up in the Congress had taken part in the riots directed against them. India was not safe for any Muslim nationalists or communalists. The two-nation theory had annihilated all political values and distinctions created by the Congress. In the last analysis, was what alone mattered was whether an Indian was a Muslim or a Hindu. His political affiliations were swept away by the fact of his professing a particular religion. History was vindicating the two-nation theory, but at what human cost? But the greatest refutation of the Congress logic is to be found in Indo-Pakistan relations after 1947. The Muslims left behind in India are still regarded by Pakistanis to be in some way related to them. Any communal reared in India sends a wave of resentment in Pakistan and the government sends a note of protest to Delhi. Similarly, in India, Hindus took to the future of the Hindu population of East Pakistan. As they are concerned, in 1950, the Prime Minister of Pakistan and India actually signed a pact, Liaquat Nehru Agreement, safeguarding the interests of Indian Muslims and Pakistan Hindus. Pakistani interest in Indian Muslims can be explained by the two-nation theory. All the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent were one nation. It was an accident of history that a portion of them was left behind in the Indian Union, but that portion is still in some extra political way an extension of Pakistani nation, because India was divided on the basis of the two-nation theory. But the interest of the Indian government in the Hindus of Pakistan is impossible of any explanation except that the Congress also had at the end accepted the two-nation theory. How else can we justify or even explain Jawaharlal Nehru's interest in East Pakistani Hindus? He looked at them as a part of the Indian nation, again in an extra political way, and therefore negotiated with the government of Pakistan for their welfare and security. This should be answer enough to those Indian leaders who still declare that they accepted the partition of India under compulsion without accepting the two-nation theory, which was the cause and the condition of the partition.